Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had always been different from the other female soldiers at Fort Braxton. While most of them struggled to keep up during the grueling physical training sessions, Maria moved with the grace and power of someone who had been training her entire life. Her fellow soldiers respected her, but they didn't know the full story of what had brought her to this moment. The morning sun was barely visible through the thick North Carolina fog as the battalion assembled for their weekly PT test. Colonel James Mitchell stood at the front of the formation, his chest puffed out with the kind of arrogance that came from 20 years of military service and never being challenged by anyone he considered beneath him. He was known throughout the base for his old-school attitudes and his belief that women simply didn't belong in combat roles. Maria stood in the back row, her dark hair pulled into a regulation bun, her uniform crisp and perfect. She watched as the colonel began his usual pre-training speech, the same tired rhetoric about military standards and the importance of maintaining physical excellence. But today something was different in his tone. There was a mocking edge to his words as his eyes scanned the female soldiers in the formation. "Ladies," Colonel Mitchell said with a smirk that made Maria's stomach turn, "I hope you've been practicing your push-ups. I'd hate to see any of you embarrass yourselves in front of the real soldiers today." A few of the male soldiers chuckled, but most remained silent, uncomfortable with their commanding officer's blatant sexism. Maria felt her jaw clench, but she remained perfectly still. She had learned long ago that reacting to ignorance only gave it more power. Instead, she focused on controlling her breathing, the way she had been taught years before in a different life, in a different world entirely. The colonel continued his speech, his voice growing louder and more condescending with each word. "Physical training isn't just about meeting minimum standards. It's about proving you have what it takes to protect the soldier next to you when the bullets start flying. It's about showing that you can carry your weight when lives are on the line." As he spoke, Maria's mind drifted back to her childhood in East Los Angeles, where she had first learned what real strength meant. Her father had abandoned the family when she was 8, leaving her mother to raise 4 children on a waitress's salary. Maria had become the protector, the one who walked her younger siblings to school and made sure they had something to eat when they got home. The streets of East LA had been her first training ground. She had learned to fight not because she wanted to, but because she had to. The older kids who tried to take her brother's lunch money, the gang members who hassled her sister on the way to the corner store, the men who thought a teenage girl walking alone was fair game. They had all taught her lessons that no military manual could provide. "Now, I know some of you think the standards have been lowered to accommodate certain individuals," the colonel continued, his eyes now focused directly on the female soldiers. "But I'm here to tell you that in my battalion, everyone meets the same requirements. No exceptions, no special treatment." Maria almost smiled at the irony. If only he knew that she had been meeting and exceeding male standards since she was 15 years old, working construction jobs during the summer to help support her family. She had carried 50-pound bags of concrete mix for 8 hours a day in the blazing California sun, her hands bleeding and her back screaming, but never once complaining because the money she earned kept the lights on at home. The formation began to move toward the PT course, and Maria fell into step with her squad. Private Johnson, a 20-year-old kid from Ohio who had joined the Army to escape a dead-end life in his small hometown, jogged beside her. He was one of the few soldiers who treated her with genuine respect, never questioning her abilities or making crude comments about her gender. "Sergeant Rodriguez," he said quietly, "the colonel seems extra hostile today. You okay with this?" Maria glanced at the young soldier and saw genuine concern in his eyes. "I'm fine, Johnson, but thank you for asking." She meant it. In a world where casual sexism was often brushed off as tradition or humor, it meant something to have allies who recognized it for what it was. As they reached the PT course, Maria began her warm-up routine. She had developed her own system over the years, a combination of military exercises and the boxing training she had pursued in her teens. Her movements were precise and purposeful, each stretch and movement serving a specific function in preparing her body for peak performance. The other soldiers noticed. They always did. There was something about the way Maria carried herself that commanded attention, a quiet confidence that spoke of experience and capability. Some of the younger male soldiers tried to copy her warm-up routine, recognizing that whatever she was doing was clearly effective. Colonel Mitchell watched from his position near the starting line, his expression growing more sour by the minute. He had been hoping to see signs of weakness, evidence to support his belief that women were inherently inferior soldiers. Instead, he was watching Staff Sergeant Rodriguez prepare for the PT test with the focused intensity of a professional athlete. The colonel's aide, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, stood beside him with a clipboard, ready to record the test results. She was one of the few officers who had the courage to challenge the colonel's attitudes, though she had to be careful about how she did it. "Sir," she said quietly, "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has consistently scored in the top 5% of the battalion on every PT test since she arrived here." Colonel Mitchell's face reddened slightly. "I'm aware of her scores, Lieutenant, but scores on paper don't always translate to real-world performance." His voice carried the edge of someone who was looking for any excuse to prove his preconceived notions. "Correct." As the soldiers lined up for the first event, Maria found herself thinking about her journey to this moment. The decision to join the military had not been easy. She had been working as a personal trainer in Los Angeles, building a successful career and finally achieving some financial stability. But something had been missing, a sense of purpose that went beyond helping wealthy clients achieve their fitness goals. The terrorist attacks on September 11th had changed everything for her. Like millions of other Americans, she had watched the coverage with a mixture of horror and determination. But unlike most, she had made the decision to do something concrete about it. Within 6 months, she had enlisted in the Army, determined to serve her country and prove that her gender had nothing to do with her ability to be an effective soldier. The first event was the 2-mile run, and as the soldiers lined up at the starting line, Maria could feel the weight of expectations pressing down on her shoulders. She had become accustomed to being watched, analyzed, and judged more harshly than her male counterparts. But today felt different. Today felt like a test that went beyond physical fitness. Colonel Mitchell positioned himself near the starting line, his stopwatch ready and his expression skeptical. "Remember, soldiers," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "this is about more than just meeting minimum standards. This is about proving you belong in the United States Army." The whistle blew and the formation took off across the base. Maria settled into her pace, her breathing controlled and steady. She had learned long ago not to start too fast, not to let adrenaline override strategy. The 2 miles ahead of her were not just a distance to cover, but a puzzle to solve. A race against the clock and against the doubts that others held about her capabilities. Running beside her were some of the battalion's strongest soldiers, men who had been training for years and who prided themselves on their physical prowess. Sergeant First Class David Thompson, a former college football player from Texas, had never been beaten by a female soldier in any physical event. He glanced over at Maria as they rounded the first corner, expecting to see signs of strain or fatigue. Instead, he saw something that surprised him. Maria was running with the easy grace of someone who was barely exerting herself, her form perfect and her breathing relaxed. She looked like she could maintain this pace for hours, not just the required 2 miles. As they passed the 1-mile marker, Maria began to pick up her pace slightly. It was a calculated move, one that would allow her to finish strong without burning out early. The strategy had been taught to her not in military training, but by Coach Martinez, an old boxer who had trained her in a converted garage in downtown Los Angeles. Coach Martinez had been a former professional fighter who had seen his career ended by injury, but who had channeled his knowledge and passion into training young fighters who couldn't afford the fancy gyms in Beverly Hills. Maria had found her way to his gym at 17, angry at the world and looking for a way to channel her frustration into something productive. "Fighting isn't about being stronger than your opponent," he had told her during one of their early training sessions. "It's about being smarter, more disciplined, and more prepared. Physical strength is just one tool in the toolbox. The mind is what wins fights." Now, as she ran through the North Carolina morning, Maria applied those lessons to the challenge at hand. She observed the other runners around her, noting their breathing patterns, their form, and their pace. She could see who was pushing too hard too early, who was holding back too much, and who might be her real competition in the final stretch. Colonel Mitchell watched from his position near the finish line, his stopwatch marking the minutes as they passed. The lead group was approaching, and he was surprised to see that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was not only keeping up with the male soldiers, but actually appeared to be holding back slightly. Lieutenant Chen stood beside him, her own stopwatch ready. Sir, she said quietly, if the sergeant maintains this pace, she'll finish in under 13 minutes. That would put her in the top 3% of all soldiers on the base. The colonel's expression darkened. Let's see how she finishes before we start handing out medals, Lieutenant. As the final half-mile approached, Maria made her move. She had been studying the other runners throughout the race, and she knew exactly when to strike. With a smoothness that surprised even herself, she shifted into a higher gear, her stride lengthening and her pace increasing. Sergeant Thompson, who had been confident in his ability to stay ahead of any female soldier, suddenly found Maria pulling alongside him. He tried to match her pace, but his earlier overconfidence had cost him. He had expended too much energy in the first mile, and now his body was paying the price. Come on. Rodriguez, he muttered through gritted teeth. Let's see what you've really got. Maria heard him but didn't respond. She had learned long ago that talking during competition was a waste of energy that could be better used for performance. Instead, she focused on her breathing, her form, and the finish line that was now visible in the distance. The other soldiers in the lead group began to realize what was happening. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez wasn't just keeping up, she was pulling away from them. The woman who had endured months of subtle discrimination and condescending comments was about to prove her critics wrong in the most decisive way possible. As they rounded the final corner, Maria could hear the voices of the other soldiers who had already finished earlier waves of the run. Some were cheering, others were simply watching in amazement. She had never sought this kind of attention, but she understood its importance. Every female soldier on the base would be judged by her performance today. With 100 yards to go, Maria was clearly in the lead. Her form remained perfect, her breathing controlled, and her pace steady. She looked like she could run another 2 miles without difficulty, while the men behind her were clearly struggling to maintain their speed. Colonel Mitchell stood at the finish line, his stopwatch in hand and his face a mask of conflicted emotions. He had spent years believing and teaching that women were inherently inferior soldiers, physically unable to meet the demands of military service. Now he was watching one of those women about to embarrass some of his best male soldiers in front of the entire battalion. This isn't possible, he muttered to Lieutenant Chen. There must be some mistake. Maybe the course was measured wrong, or maybe she took a shortcut. Lieutenant Chen looked at her commanding officer with barely concealed disgust. Sir, the course is the same one we've used for years. And Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has been in view of the observers the entire time. She ran the same distance as everyone else. As Maria crossed the finish line, the stopwatch read 12 minutes and 43 seconds. It was not just a passing score, or even a good score. It was a time that would have been impressive for any soldier, male or female. More importantly, it was a time that demolished the assumptions and prejudices that had been directed at her since the day she arrived at Fort Braxton. The soldiers who had finished behind her gathered around, some offering congratulations, others simply staring in disbelief. Sergeant Thompson, who had always prided himself on his physical fitness, extended his hand to Maria with genuine respect. Hell of a run, Sergeant, he said, his earlier competitiveness replaced by admiration. I don't know how you made that look so easy. Maria shook his hand and smiled. Just doing my job, Sergeant. Same as you. But even as she accepted the congratulations of her fellow soldiers, Maria could see Colonel Mitchell watching from the sidelines. His expression was not one of pride or respect, but of anger and resentment. She realized that her impressive performance had not changed his mind about female soldiers. It had only made him more determined to prove that she was an anomaly, an exception that proved the rule rather than challenged it. The push-up portion of the PT test began 20 minutes after the run, giving the soldiers just enough time to recover their breathing, but not enough to fully rest. Maria used this time strategically, stretching her arms and shoulders while observing the other soldiers around her. She could see the fatigue in their faces, the way some of them were already shaking their arms out and rotating their shoulders in preparation for what they knew would be a challenging test. Colonel Mitchell had moved to the push-up area and was walking among the soldiers with a clipboard, making notes and offering commentary that was clearly designed to increase their anxiety rather than encourage them. Remember, soldiers, he announced, proper form is everything. One sloppy push-up and you're done. No exceptions. The push-up test was conducted in groups of 10, with each soldier required to perform as many proper push-ups as possible in 2 minutes. The minimum standard for male soldiers was 42 push-ups, while female soldiers were required to complete 19. Maria had always found this disparity frustrating, not because she couldn't meet the male standard, but because it reinforced the assumption that women were inherently weaker. When Maria's group was called forward, she took her position on the ground alongside 9 male soldiers, including Sergeant Thompson and several others who had finished behind her in the run. The test administrator, Staff Sergeant Williams, looked down at her with surprise. "Sergeant Rodriguez, are you sure you want to test with the male standard? You can take the female test if you prefer." Maria looked up at him calmly. "I'll take the same test as everyone else, Staff Sergeant." Colonel Mitchell, who had been observing from a few feet away, stepped forward with a cruel smile. "Are you sure about that, Sergeant? The male standard is 42 push-ups. That's more than double what's required for female soldiers. I'd hate to see you fail because of misplaced pride." The other soldiers in Maria's group turned to look at her, curious to see how she would respond to the colonel's challenge. Some of them had trained with her over the past months and knew she was capable of meeting the male standard, but others were skeptical. Maria maintained her position and looked directly at Colonel Mitchell. "I understand the requirements, sir. I'm ready to proceed." The colonel's smile widened and he stepped back to observe. "Very well, Sergeant. Let's see what you're made of." As Maria waited for the command to begin, her mind drifted back to another challenge from her past. She was 16 years old, working a summer construction job to help support her family. The foreman, a man named Eddie Gonzalez, had initially been reluctant to hire a teenage girl for what he considered men's work. "Look, kid," he had said on her first day, "I'm only giving you this job because your uncle vouched for you. But if you can't keep up with the guys, you're gone. No special treatment, no crying, no excuses." Maria had spent that entire summer proving herself, carrying heavy materials, working in extreme heat, and enduring the skepticism and sometimes outright hostility of her male co-workers. But she had also learned valuable lessons about mental toughness and physical endurance that no classroom could have provided. "Soldiers, assume the starting position," Staff Sergeant Williams commanded. Maria lowered herself into the push-up position, her hands placed shoulder-width apart, her body forming a straight line from her head to her heels. Around her, the other soldiers took their positions, some of them already breathing heavily from the run and the anticipation of what was to come. "Begin." The test started and Maria immediately settled into a steady rhythm. Her form was perfect, each push-up taking her chest all the way to the ground before pushing back up to full extension. She had learned early in her military career that maintaining proper form was more important than speed, especially over the course of 2 full minutes. Around her, the other soldiers were also performing well initially, but Maria could already see the differences in their strategies. Some were going too fast, trying to rack up numbers early before fatigue set in. Others were being too conservative, worried about burning out before the 2 minutes were complete. Colonel Mitchell walked among the soldiers, counting repetitions and making comments designed to distract and intimidate. When he reached Maria, he knelt down beside her and began counting loudly. 10, 11, 12, he said, his voice carrying a tone of mock surprise. 13, 14, 15. Well, Sergeant Rodriguez, you've already exceeded the female standard. Feeling tired yet?" Maria didn't respond, maintaining her focus and her rhythm. She was at 17 push-ups, then 20, then 25, and she could feel that she was just getting warmed up. Her breathing remained controlled, her form perfect, and her pace steady. 30, 31, 32, Colonel Mitchell continued, his voice now betraying a hint of genuine surprise. 33, 34, 35. The other soldiers in Maria's group were beginning to struggle. Sergeant Thompson, who had prided himself on his upper body strength, was at 38 push-ups but clearly laboring. His form was beginning to break down and Staff Sergeant Williams had to remind him twice to maintain proper positioning. 40, 41, 42, the colonel continued, his tone now completely changed. Maria had reached the male standard and she showed no signs of slowing down. 43, 44, 45. By now, other soldiers who had completed their tests were gathering around to watch. Word had spread quickly through the battalion that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was not only meeting the male standard, but was on track to set a new battalion record. Lieutenant Chen approached the group, her own stopwatch in hand to verify the count. She had seen Maria's training sessions and knew what she was capable of. But even she was impressed by the display of strength and endurance she was witnessing. 1 minute remaining, Staff Sergeant Williams announced. Maria was at 52 push-ups, still maintaining perfect form and a steady pace. The fatigue was beginning to set in. She could feel it in her shoulders and triceps, but she had trained for this. Every morning before dawn, while most of the other soldiers were still sleeping, she had been in the gym, pushing herself beyond the minimum standards because she knew that being good enough wasn't enough when you were constantly being judged more harshly than your peers. 60, 61, 62, Colonel Mitchell continued counting, his voice now barely above a whisper. He had stopped making commentary, focusing entirely on the numbers that were challenging everything he believed about female soldiers. Around the PT area, a crowd was gathering. Soldiers from other units had heard about what was happening and were coming to witness it firsthand. Some were cheering Maria on, others were simply watching in amazement. But all of them understood that they were witnessing something significant. 30 seconds remaining, Staff Sergeant Williams announced. Maria was at 70 push-ups, and while she could feel the burn in her muscles, she also knew she had more left in reserve. She began to slightly increase her pace, drawing on the mental toughness that had been forged in the streets of East LA and refined through years of training and competition. 75, 76, 77, the colonel counted mechanically, his earlier confidence and smugness completely gone. As the final 10 seconds approached, Maria gave everything she had left. Her form remained perfect, but her speed increased as she drew on reserves of strength and determination that went far beyond physical training. Time, Staff Sergeant Williams called out. Maria completed her final push-up and held the up position, her breathing controlled despite the incredible exertion she had just put her body through. Around her, the other soldiers were lying on the ground, exhausted from their own efforts. 83, Colonel Mitchell said quietly, his voice barely audible. The crowd of soldiers that had gathered around the push-up area erupted in cheers and applause. 83 push-ups was not just an impressive score for any soldier. It was a new battalion record, breaking the previous mark of 79 that had been held by a male soldier for over 3 years. The sit-up portion of the PT test was scheduled to begin in 15 minutes, but the atmosphere around the testing area had completely changed. Word of Maria's record-breaking push-up performance had spread throughout the base, and soldiers from multiple units had gathered to witness what was becoming a legendary performance. Colonel Mitchell stood apart from the crowd, his clipboard forgotten in his hand and his face a mask of confusion and anger. He had built his entire career on certain assumptions about military capability and gender roles, and those assumptions were being systematically dismantled in front of hundreds of witnesses. Lieutenant Chen approached him cautiously, recognizing the dangerous mood her commanding officer was in. "Sir," she said quietly, "perhaps we should acknowledge Sergeant Rodriguez's exceptional performance. The soldiers are clearly inspired by what they're witnessing." The colonel turned to her with cold eyes. "Inspired? Lieutenant, what we're witnessing is a fluke, an anomaly that proves nothing about the broader capabilities of female soldiers. One exceptional individual doesn't change the fundamental realities of military service." "With respect, sir," Lieutenant Chen replied, "Sergeant Rodriguez has been consistently exceptional since she arrived here. This isn't a fluke. It's the result of dedication, training, and natural ability." Colonel Mitchell's jaw tightened. "We'll see how she performs under real pressure, Lieutenant. Physical tests are one thing, but combat is something else entirely." As Maria prepared for the sit-up test, she became aware of the crowd that had gathered and the tension that was building around her performance. She had never sought this kind of attention, but she understood its importance. Every female soldier watching would be affected by what happened here today, and that knowledge added weight to her sense of responsibility. Private Johnson approached her during the rest period, his face bright with excitement and pride. "Sergeant Rodriguez," he said quietly, "you're making history today. Do you realize that?" Maria looked at the young soldier and saw something that touched her deeply. Genuine admiration and respect, free from the condescension and skepticism she had grown accustomed to. "I'm just doing my job, Johnson. Same as always." "No, ma'am," he replied seriously. "You're doing something much more important than that. You're proving something that needed to be proven." As the sit-up test began, Maria took her position on the ground with her knees bent and her hands crossed over her chest. The soldier who would hold her feet was Corporal Martinez, a quiet professional who had trained with her on several occasions and respected her abilities. "You've got this." "Sergeant," he said quietly as he took his position, Just stay steady and trust your training. The sit-up test required soldiers to complete as many proper repetitions as possible in 2 minutes, bringing their elbows to their knees on each rep, while maintaining proper form. The minimum standard for males was 53 repetitions, while females were required to complete 50. Soldiers, assume the starting position, Staff Sergeant Williams commanded. Maria lay back on the ground, her mind focused and her body ready. She had always excelled at sit-ups, but she knew that after the intensity of the run and push-ups, this test would challenge her in different ways. Begin. Maria immediately settled into the rhythm she had practiced thousands of times. Unlike push-ups, where she could control her own pace entirely, sit-ups required coordination with the soldier holding her feet and careful attention to form to ensure each repetition counted. Colonel Mitchell positioned himself where he could observe Maria's test directly, his expression grim and his notebook ready. He was clearly hoping to find some flaw, some indication that her earlier performances had been flukes or that she was somehow cheating. 15, 16, 17, he counted, his voice carrying none of the mock encouragement he had used during the push-up test. 18, 19, 20. Around the testing area, the crowd of soldiers watched in relative silence, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Many of them had served for years without seeing any soldier, male or female, dominate a PT test the way Maria was doing. As Maria reached 30 sit-ups, she could feel the cumulative fatigue from the previous events beginning to affect her performance. Her abdominal muscles were burning, and her breathing was becoming more labored. But she had trained for exactly this situation. During her time in Los Angeles before joining the military, Maria had worked with a personal trainer named David Kim, who specialized in preparing athletes for endurance competitions. He had taught her about the psychology of fatigue and how to push through the mental barriers that caused most people to quit before their bodies actually reached their limits. Pain is temporary, he had told her, during one particularly brutal training session, but the memory of giving up lasts forever. When your body tells you it can't continue, that's usually when you're only at 60% of your actual capacity. 40, 41, 42, Colonel Mitchell continued counting, his voice becoming more mechanical as the numbers climbed higher than he had expected. Maria was now well above the minimum standards for both male and female soldiers, but she could see in the faces of the watching crowd that they expected more from her. Her earlier performances had set a new standard, and anything less than excellence would be seen as a disappointment. 50, 51, 52, the colonel continued, clearly struggling with the reality of what he was witnessing. At 53 repetitions, Maria had matched the male standard, but she showed no signs of slowing down. Her form remained perfect, and while the exertion was clearly taking its toll, her determination seemed to grow stronger with each repetition. Lieutenant Chen had positioned herself where she could observe both Maria's performance and Colonel Mitchell's reaction. She could see the internal struggle playing out on her commanding officer's face, his long-held beliefs being challenged by undeniable evidence. 1 minute remaining, Staff Sergeant Williams announced. Maria was at 65 sit-ups, and the crowd around the testing area had grown even larger. Soldiers were now 3 and 4 deep around the perimeter, and she could hear whispered conversations about whether she might break another battalion record. The current sit-up record was 78 repetitions, held by a soldier who had since transferred to another unit. It was a mark that had stood for over 2 years and was considered nearly untouchable, given the cumulative fatigue factor of taking the test after the run and push-ups. 70, 71, 72, Colonel Mitchell continued counting, his voice now barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. As the final 30 seconds approached, Maria could feel her body reaching its limits. The burning in her abdominal muscles had become intense and her breathing was labored. But she also knew that this was the moment when mental toughness mattered most. She thought about her younger siblings back in Los Angeles, about the single mother who had worked double shifts to support her family, and about all the female soldiers who would be judged based on what happened in these final seconds. The pain in her muscles became secondary to the larger purpose she was serving. 75, 76, 77, the colonel counted, his voice cracking slightly. The crowd around the testing area had fallen completely silent, understanding that they were witnessing history being made. Even the soldiers who had initially been skeptical of Maria's abilities were now watching with genuine admiration and respect. 78, Colonel Mitchell announced, his voice barely above a whisper. Maria had tied the battalion record and there were still 15 seconds remaining on the clock. 79, he continued, and the crowd erupted in cheers despite the fact that the test wasn't over. Maria completed her 80th repetition just as Staff Sergeant Williams called time, setting a new battalion record in the third consecutive event. As she lay on the ground catching her breath, the crowd of soldiers around her exploded in applause and cheers. Corporal Martinez, who had been holding her feet throughout the test, looked down at her with obvious admiration. 80 repetitions, Sergeant. That was incredible. Maria sat up slowly, her abdominal muscles screaming in protest, and looked around at the crowd of soldiers who were celebrating her performance. For the first time since arriving at Fort Braxton, she felt like she had truly earned the respect of her peers. As Maria stood up from the sit-up test, her body trembling slightly from the incredible exertion, she noticed that Colonel Mitchell had walked away from the testing area. His clipboard lay abandoned on a nearby bench, and his usual commanding presence had been replaced by something she had never seen before: uncertainty and frustration. The crowd of soldiers around her continued to celebrate, but Maria was focused on what came next. She had dominated 3 consecutive events, setting records and exceeding every expectation, but she knew that Colonel Mitchell would not let this stand without a response. Men like him didn't change their fundamental beliefs based on evidence that contradicted their worldview. They found ways to dismiss or diminish that evidence. Lieutenant Chen approached Maria as she was cooling down, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. Sergeant Rodriguez, she said quietly, that was an absolutely extraordinary performance. I've never seen anything like it. Thank you, Lieutenant, Maria replied, but she could see something else in the officer's eyes. Is there something wrong? Lieutenant Chen glanced around to make sure they couldn't be overheard, then leaned in closer. The colonel has requested that you participate in an additional evaluation. He's citing Regulation 351, which allows commanding officers to require supplementary testing when they have concerns about the validity of recorded scores. Maria felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the cooling sweat on her skin. What kind of additional evaluation? He wants you to complete the combat fitness test immediately following the completion of the regular PT test, Lieutenant Chen explained. Full gear, weapons carry, obstacle course, and tactical scenarios. It's unusual to require this without advance notice, but technically within his authority. The combat fitness test was a grueling evaluation designed to simulate the physical demands of actual combat situations. Soldiers typically prepared for it specifically and took it when they were rested and focused. Taking it immediately after completing a record-breaking PT test would be extraordinarily difficult, even for someone in Maria's exceptional physical condition. I understand, Maria said calmly, though inside she felt a surge of anger at the obvious unfairness of the situation. When does he want to begin? 15 minutes, Lieutenant Chen replied. And Sergeant, he's invited observers from the other battalions on base. This is going to be very public. As word spread about the additional testing, the crowd around the PT area began to grow even larger. Soldiers from across Fort Braxton were arriving to witness what was being described as the ultimate test of female combat capability. Maria realized that this had evolved far beyond a simple PT test. It had become a referendum on women in combat roles. During the brief rest period, Maria tried to focus on her breathing and recovery while mentally preparing for what was to come. The combat fitness test would require her to carry a 40-pound pack, drag a 185-pound dummy, navigate an obstacle course, and complete various tactical scenarios while being evaluated on both speed and accuracy. Private Johnson approached her with a water bottle and a look of deep concern. Sergeant Rodriguez, he said quietly, this isn't fair. You've already proven everything you need to prove today. Maria accepted the water gratefully and looked at the young soldier who had become one of her strongest supporters. Johnson, she said, fairness isn't really the point here. The colonel is trying to prove something to himself and to everyone watching. The only way to handle that is to take away his ability to make excuses. But you're already exhausted from the PT test, Johnson protested. Nobody could be expected to perform at their best under these conditions. That's exactly why I have to do it, Maria replied. If I refuse or make excuses, it validates everything he believes about female soldiers. If I fail, he'll use it as evidence that women can't handle combat stress. The only option is to succeed. As the 15-minute rest period ended, Colonel Mitchell reappeared with several other officers from different units on the base. His expression was grim and determined, and Maria could see that he had convinced himself that this additional testing would expose what he saw as the fraud of her earlier performance. Staff. "Sergeant Rodriguez," he announced loudly enough for the entire crowd to hear. "Based on your exceptional performance on the standard PT test, I'm invoking my authority under Regulation 351 to conduct supplementary combat readiness evaluation. This will ensure that your recorded scores accurately reflect your capabilities under realistic combat conditions." The other officers looked uncomfortable with the obvious targeting that was taking place, but none of them challenged the colonel's authority. Lieutenant Chen stood beside Maria, her jaw clenched with barely controlled anger at the obvious unfairness of the situation. "I understand, sir," Maria replied calmly. "I'm ready to proceed." The combat fitness test began with the equipment carry, a timed event requiring soldiers to transport a 40-pound pack, weapon, and additional gear over a half-mile course that included various obstacles and terrain changes. Maria strapped on the heavy pack, feeling the additional weight settling on shoulders that were already fatigued from her earlier performance. As she began the course, Maria found herself drawing on mental reserves that went beyond physical training. She thought about her mother, working double shifts as a waitress to support 4 children, never complaining about the physical toll or the unfairness of her situation. She thought about her siblings looking up to her as their protector and provider, counting on her strength when their world seemed overwhelming. The weight of the pack and gear seemed to disappear as Maria focused on the larger purpose of what she was accomplishing. Each step was not just about completing a test, but about proving that determination and preparation could overcome prejudice and preconceived limitations. Colonel Mitchell and the other officers followed the course in a military vehicle, timing each section and recording her performance. Maria could feel their scrutiny, but she refused to let it distract her from the task at hand. As she completed the equipment carry portion of the test, Maria could hear the cheers and encouragement from the soldiers who had gathered along the course. Their support gave her additional strength, reminding her that she was not just fighting for herself, but for every female soldier who would face similar challenges in the future. The obstacle course portion of the test required Maria to navigate a series of barriers, walls, and tactical scenarios while wearing full combat gear. Each obstacle was designed to simulate challenges that soldiers might face in actual combat situations, requiring strength, agility, and problem-solving skills under pressure. Maria attacked each obstacle with the same methodical approach she had used during the PT test, focusing on technique and efficiency rather than brute force. Her years of diverse physical training, from construction work to boxing to military preparation, had given her a unique combination of skills that served her well in this environment. As she completed each section of the course, Maria could see the expressions on the faces of the observing officers changing from skepticism to amazement. Even Colonel Mitchell, who had designed this test to expose her limitations, was beginning to realize that his plan was backfiring. The final portion of the test was the casualty evacuation scenario, requiring Maria to drag a 185-pound dummy representing a wounded soldier across 50 yards of varied terrain while maintaining tactical awareness and accuracy in simulated combat conditions. As Maria approached the dummy, her body screaming with fatigue from the cumulative effects of the entire day's testing, she felt a moment of doubt. The weight was substantial, the distance significant, and her energy reserves were nearly depleted. For the first time all day, she wondered if she might actually fail. But as she bent down to grab the dummy's harness, Maria heard something that changed everything. From the crowd of watching soldiers came a voice she recognized. Private Johnson calling out clear and strong, "You've got this, Sergeant. Show them what we already know." The voice was joined by others, soldiers from across the base who had been inspired by her performance and who understood the larger significance of what was happening. Their support gave Maria the final surge of determination she needed to complete the ultimate test. Maria grabbed the casualty dummy's harness and began the drag across the 50 yards of rough terrain. Every muscle in her body protested, her breathing was labored, and sweat poured down her face, but she maintained a steady pace. The voices of the supporting soldiers grew louder with each step. creating an energy that seemed to lift her beyond her physical limitations. Colonel Mitchell watched from the finish line, his stopwatch in hand and his expression growing darker by the minute. What was supposed to be his definitive proof that female soldiers couldn't handle combat stress was instead becoming another demonstration of exceptional capability. Maria completed the casualty drag within the required time standard. The crowd of soldiers erupted in the loudest cheers of the day. She had not only passed every portion of the combat fitness test, but had done so with times that would have been respectable for any soldier taking the test under ideal conditions. Lieutenant Chen approached Maria as she stood catching her breath, her uniform soaked with sweat and her face flushed with exertion. "Sergeant Rodriguez," she said with obvious admiration, "you've just completed one of the most extraordinary demonstrations of physical and mental toughness I've ever witnessed." Maria nodded her thanks but kept her eyes on Colonel Mitchell, who was standing apart from the celebrating crowd with several other officers. She could see animated discussion taking place, and she knew that her performance had created a problem that went beyond simple test scores. As the crowd began to disperse, Colonel Mitchell finally approached Maria directly. His face was a mask of controlled anger, and she could see that the events of the day had pushed him to a breaking point. "Sergeant Rodriguez," he said in a voice that carried clearly across the testing area, "I want to congratulate you on your performance today. It was exceptional." There was something in his tone that made Maria immediately wary. The colonel was not someone who gave compliments easily, and certainly not to female soldiers who had just challenged his fundamental beliefs about military capability. "However," he continued, his voice growing louder, "I think it's important that everyone here understands what we've really witnessed today." The soldiers who had been walking away stopped and turned back, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Lieutenant Chen stepped closer to Maria, her expression concerned. Colonel Mitchell walked to the center of the group, his voice now carrying the authoritative tone of a commanding officer addressing his troops. "What we've seen today is an impressive individual performance, but it's important not to draw the wrong conclusions about broader military policy." Maria felt her stomach tighten as she realized where this was heading. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez is clearly an exceptional athlete," the colonel continued. "But exceptional athletes don't represent the capabilities of an entire gender. We can't make policy decisions based on outliers and anomalies." The crowd of soldiers grew quiet, understanding that they were witnessing a confrontation that went far beyond test scores and physical performance. "Furthermore," Colonel Mitchell said, his voice growing more passionate, "physical fitness tests, no matter how challenging, cannot replicate the psychological stress and emotional demands of actual combat. The ability to do push-ups and run fast has nothing to do with the ability to kill the enemy or watch your fellow soldiers die." Maria felt the words like physical blows, not because they challenged her performance, but because she recognized the deeper prejudice and fear they represented. The colonel wasn't questioning her individual capabilities. He was denying the possibility that any woman could possess the fundamental qualities necessary for combat leadership. As the colonel continued his speech, something inside Maria reached a breaking point. She had endured months of subtle discrimination, had proven herself repeatedly through exceptional performance, and had just completed one of the most demanding physical tests possible under deliberately unfair conditions. But the colonel's response was to diminish her achievements and use them as evidence for the very prejudices she had been fighting against. Without saying a word, Maria walked to where her military jacket was hanging and began to take it off. The simple action drew the attention of every soldier in the area, including Colonel Mitchell, who stopped mid-sentence to watch what she was doing. As Maria removed her jacket, the crowd gasped collectively. Her arms and shoulders, normally hidden under her military uniform, revealed a physique that spoke of years of serious training and dedication, but more importantly, they revealed something that none of them had known about her background of running. Along her right shoulder was a tattoo that read, "Semper," to the motto of the United States Marine Corps. Below it was a series of military decorations inked permanently into her skin: the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star, and the Combat Action Ribbon. Lieutenant Chen stared in shock, finally understanding why Maria had seemed so comfortable with the physical and mental demands of military service. "Sergeant Rodriguez," she said quietly, "you're a Marine veteran?" Maria nodded, her eyes still fixed on Colonel Mitchell, who had gone completely silent. 3 deployments in Afghanistan: convoy security, forward operating bases, and direct combat operations. The crowd of soldiers was now completely silent, the weight of this revelation settling over them. They had been witnessing not just exceptional physical performance, but the demonstration of capabilities forged in actual combat. "I've been shot at by enemy fighters," Maria continued, her voice calm, but carrying an edge that none of them had heard before. "I've pulled wounded soldiers out of burning vehicles. I've called in airstrikes on enemy positions and watched fellow Marines die in my arms." Colonel Mitchell's face had gone pale. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. "So when you talk about psychological stress and emotional demands," Maria said, stepping closer to the colonel, "you're talking to someone who has already proven herself under those conditions. When you question whether women can handle the reality of combat, you're questioning the service and sacrifice of female veterans who have already paid that price." The silence in the area was complete. Every soldier present understood that they had just witnessed something far more significant than an exceptional PT performance. They had seen the systematic dismantling of prejudice through the presentation of undeniable truth. "The reason I didn't tell anyone about my Marine service," Maria continued, "is because I wanted to be judged on my current performance, not on past accomplishments. I wanted to prove that female soldiers deserve respect based on what they can do today, not what they've done before." Colonel Mitchell stood frozen, his clipboard forgotten in his hand and his authority completely undermined. The woman he had been trying to humiliate and diminish had just revealed herself to be more experienced in combat operations than most of the male soldiers under his command. "But since you've made this about more than individual performance," Maria said, "since you've made this about whether women belong in combat roles, I thought you should know that some of us have already been there. Some of us have already proven everything you think we need to prove." As Maria put her jacket back on, the crowd of soldiers began to applaud again, but this time the sound was different. It wasn't just appreciation for physical performance. It was recognition of service and sacrifice, and acknowledgement that their assumptions about their fellow soldier had been completely wrong. Colonel Mitchell turned and walked away without another word, his earlier confidence replaced by the humiliation of having his prejudices exposed in front of hundreds of witnesses. The soldiers around Maria pressed forward to offer their congratulations and respect, but many of them also wanted to apologize for the assumptions they had made. As the crowd finally began to disperse, Lieutenant Chen approached Maria one final time. "Sergeant Rodriguez," she said, "why didn't you tell us? Why did you let him treat you that way when you had the authority of combat experience to shut it down?" Maria looked at the young officer with understanding and compassion. "Because, Lieutenant, real change doesn't come from pulling rank or demanding respect based on past accomplishments. Real change comes from proving your worth every single day, under whatever conditions you're given, until the evidence becomes impossible to ignore." The sun was setting over Fort Braxton as Maria finally left the PT field, but the impact of that day's events would resonate far beyond the base. Word of her performance and the revelation of her background would spread throughout the military community, becoming a story that would be told and retold whenever someone questioned the capabilities of female soldiers. More importantly, every female soldier who heard the story would understand that they had an example to follow, proof that excellence and determination could overcome even the most entrenched prejudice, and every male soldier would be reminded that their assumptions about their fellow service members might be based more on bias than reality. Maria had not set out to make a statement or challenge the system. She had simply chosen to do her best under difficult circumstances, to meet every challenge with professionalism and capability. But sometimes the most powerful statements come not from grand gestures, but from the quiet determination to excel regardless of the obstacles placed in your path.